Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Oliver Turnbull, Deputy Vice Chancellor of Teaching and Learning and Professor of Neuropsychology at Prifyscal Bangor University. And it is an absolute honor to have you on today to talk about your book, Mistakes in Clinical Neuropsychology. Dr. Turnbull, thank you.
It's a pleasure. I should say it's in Wales, but Bangor University is in Wales. It's an important part of our identity that we're not England, but that's another story.
Yeah, I understand that is a long and complex history, and I did appreciate that I was getting dual language emails. I was like, so
we're the most bilingual university in the UK.
Oh,
so
I love that.
But we're here to talk about brains, not universities. I suppose.
No worries. No, that's fascinating to me, but I have a feeling that would be more than an hour-long conversation. So. When we talk about this book, why this book? Why did you feel the need to write this?
Yeah, the introduction to the book said there are two reasons for doing it. Well, one emotional and one educational. So the education one is the gap. Lots of people talk about the importance of making mistakes and reflecting on our mistakes, and we found plenty of people saying how important mistakes were in the literature, but no one actually describing their mistakes. No one goes to a conference to say, I'm going to present my best mistake in this talk. And that speaks to the other issue, the emotional one, which is that the mistakes are embarrassing. They're a sign that you've made an error. Who wants to talk about, your failures in public? But they are very important. So for us, it was important to try to grasp the nettle. So we wrote, between the three of us, 14 stories, sort of Oliver Sacks style stories, if you know, the man who mistook his wife for a hat type stories, about 14 different mistakes. Some of them are in the sort of assessment process of people who have brain injury, and some of them in management and rehabilitation. And we hope that people can use them as a tool to try to, reflect on the nature of their errors. I spoke to a medical colleague of mine who said, no doctor would ever write a book on mistakes. What happens if you get sued? So none of the stories are completely about a single patient. And also in many of the stories, the mistake is caught in supervision. So you make the mistake as a trainee, you go to your supervisor, you realize you've been an idiot. The supervisor points the mistake out to you, and then the patient treatment is not impaired. So that's why I'm hoping I won't be appearing in court. We'll have to see. So that's the reason for the book.
I'm not going to lie. I did, as I got to read a couple of these, I really enjoyed that they were at least had happy endings, right? Because like you said, it's like reading a horror story. You're like, you go through, you're like, oh no. Like you're like watching someone's treatment go off the rails, and it's like, oh, okay, we're back.
So as someone who's not in the discipline, I'm very interested to know how you found them. Were they readable? Was it a bit too technical in parts, or?
Oh, they were absolutely fascinating. No, I was actually, something I wanted to mention was, I was expecting to have to dig through some technical, maybe Google some stuff. Found it very readable and very enjoyable. Like it definitely had, it was really, really fascinating. What's your connection with, I noticed, and I'm probably going to say this wrong, but Rudy Koetzer?
Yeah.
I noticed that they wrote most of these.
So Rudy is my local clinician. He arrived, actually trained in South Africa, which is another story, but he arrived and set up the North Wales Brain Injury Service where I live 25 years ago. So we're about the same age, and I'm the sort of the university professor guy, and he does work for the university some of the time as well, but he's the clinician. So I have a long-standing connection with him, and he sort of grounds me because I don't see all that many patients. And then Christian Salas, who's a generation younger than me, was my PhD student. He came to us on a fully funded scholarship from Chile, actually, about 15 years ago. He worked with Rudy and myself. He spent time in the brain injury service, and he's gone back, I think, to be a central part of clinical neuropsychology in Chile. It's not often. One of my students has gone to found maybe I'm exaggerating to say found the discipline in a country, but it's he really will be right there at the start of the new field. So it felt very special for me. Rudy's also
and actually, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say Rudy's also written a book on doing clinical neuropsychology in resource-constrained circumstances. Sort of developing world. Although, frankly, healthcare systems all across the world, even OECD countries, are struggling. So we have a particular connection with doing things when resources limited. Anyway, sorry, you're going to ask another question.
Yeah, well, as you were talking about Christian starting in, or at least very in a big fundamental way contributing to the discipline in Chile. I think it's a great time to ask what there's a lot of things when you say clinical neuropsychology. You have clinical and neuro in front of psychology. What is how would you define the discipline?
Sure. So let's do neuropsychology first. The mind is the thing that people think that psychologists study, but plainly it has a physical instantiation in the brain. We like to view it, maybe now's not the time for a philosophical discussion, but Spinoza is our lighthouse on this one. We believe that you can see the mental apparatus, if you want to call it that, from two different perspectives, either sort of internally experiencing it as a mind or externally viewing it as a brain. So if you liked the hardware-software analogy, then neuropsychology is the hardware stuff. We're interested in knowing how the mind really works. The other little analogy I like to use, because it's just to try to get people's heads around the concept, would be about motor cars. Everyone is like a car driver in that you own a mind and you learn gradually how to drive it. And if you turn the steering wheel and put the brakes on, things happen. That's what being a mind is like. But almost nobody knows how they work. And how they work is lifting up the bonnet. You've frozen a bit there. Lifting up the bonnet, and there's a whole ton of machinery that turns your steering wheel or your gear thing into an action. So we're the under the bonnet people. The difference, of course, well, there are many differences, but is that we didn't design the thing. So we're trying to work out after the fact how on earth this extraordinarily complicated machine actually works. So that's starting with psychology, the mind. Then we're interested in the brain stuff, and then clinical is the thing that turns it into a field that belongs in the sort of broader family of medical sciences. So your brain gets injured in all sorts of ways, probably most commonly through head injury, and motor car accidents, for example, falls, or indeed through stroke. Any sort of blood supply problem to the brain. And in later life, of course, dementia is the other big category. So in that sense, it has all these related fields around neuropsychology, which, as I point out in the last chapter of the book, you've kind of got to know. You've got to know neuroanatomy, you've got to know clinical neurology, you've got to know something about neuroradiography and statistics and psychometric assessment. So it's a field that touches on a lot of other disciplines, but that also makes it really fascinating. So it appeals to our students, often of psychology, who don't like the fuzzier aspect of the discipline, but who are more interested in the kind of hard science stuff. So and just if I can finish this on a personal note, we get to study stuff that's really at the cutting edge of science. We think we own the biggest problem in all of science. The problem of consciousness. Your kidney and livers are run using the same kinds of cells that are in your brain, but somehow, at least some parts of your brain create this amazing subjective feeling. And we sort of know where that happens, which we call the easy problem of consciousness. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the philosophy behind it, but the easy part was working out where it happens, more or less. The hard problem of consciousness, which we just don't know anything about, is why it produces this amazing subjective state. So I just consider myself really to be very lucky to be working in a field that's about such amazing stuff. Anyway, sorry, I don't want to ramble on here too much.
No, that was it was a great answer. Even as you talk about the subjective experience, I think there's, you talked about this Oliver Sacks style, and you mentioned a little bit about it in the preface. What is the value of the emotional and kind of this even a little bit of a first person approach to doing these case reports? Why is that valuable for students and for other clinicians?
The first person narratives are always more engaging. And particularly, when they have an emotional component, and being an idiot 14 times in the book, which is more or less what we do, is likely to do that. I'm a fan of data plus anecdote. So obviously we teach our students using lots of papers in the scientific literature and so on that are that aren't anecdote based, but there is something about lived experience, which is this is our field. We are mind people as well as brain people. So I think trying to get a sense of what it's like to be somebody else's mind is more easily approached from that anecdote or that story perspective, I think, than just sort of hard facts. And I think that the book does have examples of what it's like to be a different sort of mind, which is really what neuropsychology is, and how to extract that material from the patient and sometimes their family members in a way that makes brain sense. That's the tricky part for me. If you don't mind me giving an example, seeing as we're talking about anecdotes.
No, please.
I talk, I think it's in the second chapter, The Wrong Amnesia. I'm about to talk about it in Dublin next week. So I've been thinking about how I would talk about it. And at the beginning of that chapter, there's a really bossy mother. She's called Mrs. Merton, which is a joke, a British television joke, which I'm not so sure, but there was a character called Mrs. Merton who had her own television program, and and Mrs. Merton describes her son's memory problems. She doesn't give him any space to talk on his own. It's just all about mom. And she describes the memory problems with the wrong use of the word amnesia, or at least about things that are not the amnesia that we care about as clinicians. The whole nature of the story, if you remember the second chapter, is that he makes mistakes because he's dysexecutive. He doesn't concentrate very well. His mind wanders. He doesn't bring structure to material to remember or try to make it relevant for himself. So he's forgetful. And she describes his memory errors in a way that, as a naive trainee, you think, oh, he's amnesic, is he? That's the issue. But he's not amnesic, which is the whole basis of that mistake. But you need to listen like a clinician. She says he's amnesic because he often forgets to choose the right words, which is a thing in neuropsychology. It's called anomia, but it's not an amnesia. It's just
right.
Looked at from another perspective. Everything the brain does is memory, arguably. So, for me, the fun part of making it an anecdote, a story, was that you could see the clinician making the mistake as a trainee in a way that is more memorable than me standing up in front of my students and saying, you need to listen like a brain scientist, not like someone taking dictation. It's not a. It's.
I was about to reference that line. It's a. Yeah, you could easily see how you'd fall into that.
Yeah, and it is. I when I was training, I started to realize that I had a sort of visual image of the person's brain while they were talking, and that I would sort of see, I don't know, areas light up is the wrong phrase, but while they were describing particular sorts of errors, oh, I see, that's a visuospatial impairment, so I can see why it would be, what's the right parietal surface looking like, and so on. So it changed the way I listen to people in a really quite important way. It's I wasn't only listening for the meaning, I was listening for the anatomy, which is it took me a while to get my head around the mapping, but it is possible to do. Probably people who fix motor cars, just to go back to our earlier analogy, do exactly the same thing. They probably think, this is probably a problem in the distributor or something. I don't know how you make the diagnosis. I can't fix cars, but or no one's allowed to these days anyway. But it was very much that a process of learning to listen in a different way. We quote, if I can keep talking, Kevin Walsh, the famous clinician whose gnomes. I don't know if you like the little gnome reference in the book, sort of areas of knowledge, little anecdotes. That neuropsychology is a body contact sport. That you need to meet people and see lots of cases in order to try to understand how this strange thing works. And you need to see lots of different disorders. So I quite like that, and I hope you enjoyed the aphorisms as well.
Yes, I did, and even as you're talking about how much you visualize, you referenced it before we started. Have you found painting the brain to be helpful both in your teaching, but also in your own process of understanding this?
Yeah, there's nothing quite so hard as or focusing you so much as painting something. I run a summer school, the Visceral Mind Summer School here in Bangor, in which we kidnap 30 or so students every year and lock them in the halls of residence, and they do nothing but brains for a whole week. It's really a wonderful experience, and I teach them on the principle that if you can't draw it and label it, you don't know it. So for me, the worst kind of anatomy teaching, I'm going to pretend that no one ever does this, is in which the teacher shows you a brain thing and says, "Oh, that's the hippocampus," or that's the corpus callosum, and the student says, "Great," and nods their head. You learn nothing through that system because a 5-year-old can nod, or they're also coloring in books for the brain, in which you buy pictures of the brain and you color them in, but they've done all the hard work for you. A 5-year-old can color in. So I teach our students for about a dozen different diagrams, a line drawing of the brain. Here's how you do it, and here's how you label all the 20 or 30 different parts. And then we ask them to turn the piece of paper over, and we give them a new blank piece of paper, and we say, "Okay, draw it." And they're not very good the first time, and then they practice it again, and they practice. So painting is a similar sort of thing. It's when you've got that blank piece of paper, you've really got to know your stuff. And the brain paintings I do, including the ones that are behind my shoulder here. Those are not my first attempts. I drew them or painted them again and again and again, and you'd get it wrong. And then, in fact, most frustratingly, sometimes I'd get the labeling wrong after I'd gone to all the trouble of painting them, which was a nightmare. So yep. I've got a couple of spare mistakes of each of those paintings that I made. It's a really I think, important discipline to be able to imagine the spatial relationships between things. And painting really requires you to do that. So I find it very useful.
Yeah, even as you're talking about learning from failure, really, right? Like it's that it's the difficulty that you're asking them to do, and you're talking about like lived experience. What do you think is the value from a pedagogical standpoint of working through the emotions of failure?
Well, I mean, if we've learned anything from 150 years of memory research, which I think I talk about in the last chapter, it's not only about the importance of repetition, which is good, but that repetition is driven by feelings. We're only driven to the reason I think I say in the book, the reason you remember your first kiss and not your 1000th kiss with somebody is because the first one was really powerful. And you repeated it, you thought it over, you savored the moment. Whereas things get a bit samey after 1,000. So that's the first thing, is that emotion drives repetition, and also the other thing which really helps memory is depth of processing. The more you can connect it to other parts of your knowledge system, the better you're going to remember anything. So that process of going over something that you care about is really helpful for that depth of processing. It's the more you keep on thinking about the thing from a different perspective, the more it connects to other parts of your mental life. And that's that meaning drives recall. So I don't know which things you've learned in your life, but you will have the ones you've successfully learned. You'll have done them, for 10,000 hours or whatever the famous number is that people choose, and you'll have thought about it in innumerable ways. You'll have read books about it. You'll have talked to your friends about it. You'll have researched it and looked it up, and you get a 360 perspective on the thing, and emotion does that for you. It's the engine that gets us out of bed in the morning. So that's more or less what I've spent. My interest is in emotion neuroscience. What is the brain basis of feelings and how we manage them? And there's a fair amount of that, I think, in the book as well. Because one of the things that goes wrong after a brain injury is that you lose the ability to properly manage your feelings. And how can we help our patients with that? That's I'd be happy to talk about that if you want. So, but you ask your next question.
I would love. Yeah, no. I would love to talk more about that. I did want to just touch briefly. You talked about there is a lot of talk about how important acknowledging mistakes are, but there's no real literature about the mistakes. Do you feel a responsibility, and do you have any desires or goals for this book in terms of the field itself and what you want to encourage?
Yeah. So we got the forward, who's a good friend of ours, Jonathan Evans, who runs the program in Glasgow, and who's the president of the International Neuropsychology Society this year, actually, to write a very nice forward. And he talked about making it recommended reading on his program. I'm really hopeful that wherever clinical neuropsychologists train, that it'll be something you can recommend for them. But I also feel, and I've been invited to talk to audiences who aren't clinical neuropsychologists, because the principles of this are not, they're not unique to the field. They're about the importance of growing your knowledge base, the importance of tying together. I think no piece is the whole jigsaw is a quote I have in the last chapter. The importance of seeing a case in the round and not being dazzled but by one element of it, or the importance, I think it's a third recommendation, of not judging too fast and taking a bit of time and maybe speaking to other people, or even just presenting the case to yourself to see whether the ducks line up. Those are problems certainly that apply, to every part of medicine or the fields allied to medicine. And frankly, people are making mistakes in every field in the world. So, the important thing for me is the attitude we take towards the mistakes. I think that last chapter, which has got a title about appreciating errors, it's hard to acknowledge, but if you, because we feel so powerfully about the mistakes, it's more likely to help us. It can be an engine for growth, or you can just choose to avoid it. Try to sweep it all under the carpet and ignore all our mistakes, so that you can just make the same mistakes over and over again.
Which I like. In the short term, you want to avoid the mistakes, and that feels better. But in the long term, that there's more pain. But even as you're talking about separate fields, I'm reminded of, as you talk about presenting to yourself, there's a common tool for computer programmers is they'll, I'm sure they use different sorts of things, but what they talk about is the rubber ducky, and they put a rubber ducky up on their desk. And when they're stuck on a programming problem, they talk through it to the rubber ducky, and that's a common way of solving it. But I wanted to return, because you mentioned you were interested in sharing this. How do you help patients when they are trying to deal with emotional processing problems that come from physical sources?
Well, I mean, the issue really for us is this thing we call emotion regulation. How do we manage our feelings? Feelings are really powerful. We all are overwhelmed by them when we're small children, because the relevant bits of the brain haven't developed yet, which is why children, get so delighted and also terrified, also angry, So the developmental achievement is finding ways to manage our feelings. And it's the number one predictor of, or a major predictor of mental health. Managing them badly is a huge cause of distress for people. So our patients lose the bit of the brain that we use to manage those feelings. So that they're left in that developmentally earlier phase of being terrified to go into the shops, because there's so many things and bright lights, and it's just So, but also because those skills are executive abilities, as we call them. Our patients are dysexecutive. They have difficulty focusing attention, solving problems, error correction, and so on. We need to be able to find tools that our patients can take away with them and use. There's a chapter in the book called "Concrete Patients Need Concrete Therapists." So, our patients need simple, practical solutions to problems, and they benefit the most from those. So, just to choose an emotion regulation example, if our patients are troubled by going to the shops because it's all too overwhelming, that there's too long a list of things for them to get, and too many people and too many bright lights and so on. Well, do you have to go when everybody else is there? Could you go at 9 o'clock at night when the shops are much quieter? Could you take somebody with you? Could you make sure you've got a list and you agree beforehand that you would tick it all off, so you don't make any impulsive extra purchases and so on, So just, simple strategies seem to really help our patients, and not just on the emotion front. One of the chapters on rehab called Thinking Inside the Box, which I quite liked as a chapter title, is about the memory aid that we teach for our patients. So our patients are forgetful, probably because they don't pay very much attention, and they're always losing their keys and forgetting to do things and so on. A problem that lots of us have, but our patients especially so. And we recommend a box. We say they're nice and cheap because the delivery companies bring you a free one every time they drop something off at your house. And we encourage our patients to put the box by the front door. If they're really forgetful, we ask them to put it in front of the door, so you can't open the door And when you come in, you put everything you need in that box: your glasses, your phone, your wallet, and if there's something you need to take with you tomorrow, you don't try to remember to get it tomorrow. You take it now and you put it in the box, so that it just makes it much. It simplifies the process of memory recall for our patients, and they really benefit from it. So these are memory solutions to help our patients, which you don't need, aren't too cognitively demanding, and which they can take away with them. And we run a little intervention program of 7 or 8 sessions for patients with acquired brain injury here in North Wales. And we really focus on those sorts of issues, how to manage your feelings. We give people simple workbooks, and we've had pretty good outcomes, actually.
Yeah, and of course, there's also the surgery side, which comes up. That was the
which story were you thinking
obvious,
of?
but I was gonna say the mistake was obvious, but it's the first one by Dr. Coetzer on the bit of knife in left in the person's skull, and I was like, definitely would want to know if it was a hammer or a fist, and then you find out it was a knife that had gone into and that's why he couldn't remember, and I was like,
yeah, I understand. It's that's the one on history, isn't it? And the importance
yes.
of taking a history. It's I think Rudy opens that chapter by talking about how easy it is to get overconfident. You've seen a lot of cases, and you think you've got it all done, and you can cut corners, but there are reasons that the fundamentals are fundamental, and in the clinical world, getting a decent history and properly understanding it is really critical. One of my favorite stories later in the book is famously one in which I wasn't even assessing the patient. I don't know if you remember it, but it's the one in which the patient speaks a language that I don't. I can't get anybody else to translate for me, but unfortunately the patient is there with his daughter. So I asked her to translate, and she does a perfectly reasonable job. So I think, and I make what I think is a perfectly reasonable diagnosis, leave the room to discover that a registrar who's there does speak the patient's language. So I asked them if they just see the patient for 2 minutes. And it becomes clear that the patient, I'll tell you the answer to the story, is a non-fluent aphasic. So the aphasias come in 2 varieties, these language disorders. Some of them are production errors. So the patients really struggle, especially to produce nouns. So their speech looks very hesitant. I could make a diagnosis of that in any language in the world, because the patient just doesn't produce much stuff. But the other sort, the receptive ones, the patients can still produce words, but then they're not coherent anymore. We call it word salad. And so that's what this patient was doing. He was just producing nonsense. I didn't know it was nonsense because I didn't speak the language. And his daughter was telling me what her understanding of the patient's problem was. She wasn't very well connected. So it was a dreadful mistake to make, and I won't make the same mistake twice. Maybe these days, there's a Babel fish coming, isn't there? Which will just put your phone out there and it'll do the translation. but back in the day, there wasn't. And so my original point was that the fundamentals of taking a history. Neuropsychologists in my field or trainees anyway, can be very obsessed with the tests. So you do the test, and if you fail, then bingo, you found the patient's problem. The analogy I use, which I think is in the last chapter, is that, to be honest, you shouldn't need to test the patient, or not very much. You reach the conclusion based primarily on the history and their presentation in front of you, and you do the testing to confirm what you probably already knew. So the analogy I have is in football, where everyone enjoys kicking the ball into the back of the net. But the hard work was done moving the ball down the pitch into the penalty area. It's and that's what the history is. Is understanding what on earth the patient's problem is, and then the tests are more confirmatory. So there are a few errors in the book that are of exactly that sort, I suppose.
My background's in philosophical hermeneutics, and one of the things that really stuck out to me as I worked my way through the book was how much of this is about the interpretational matrix you're constructing, right? And what you allow to, what gets in the way. And a lot of it is trying to fix, as you say, to stop and take a deep breath. One of my favorite examples, and this is the kind of stuff that made it funny to me. I would probably have been better served by going to the hospital canteen afterwards and thinking the case through while sipping a cup of their undrinkable coffee. It's those little. I have had my share of hospital coffee, and I don't recommend it either.
Yeah, but it's the equivalent of the duck, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the thing which gives you a bit of time and a bit of perspective. And of course, a fair amount of processing is done, outside of conscious awareness in the first place. So just if you have the luxury of time, I think there's a real advantage in just even doing something else. I think that sentence carries on to say you could talk to the hospital porter about the weather. Processing would still be going on somewhere. I think the analogy I use in that chapter is about, which is, I think, no piece is the whole jigsaw. You need the history that the patient gives you needs to align with their presentation in the room, which needs to align with test performance, or what you hear about their behavior, for example, in the workplace. And if those don't align, you should be ringing alarm bells and maybe just going back to basics and saying, could it be a different disease process? Could it be two pathologies? Could one of your sources of information be inaccurate? Could the family have not told you the right history? Another one of our examples is a medical legal case. Rudy talks about it, in which the patient, as I think I say in the last chapter, in which the patient is either not trying to do well or trying to do badly, one of the two, and we probably will never know, and because there is insufficient effort, as it's now called in my field, it is a real thing, especially when it comes to medical legal claims. There are huge amounts of money at play here, and an important part of being a neuropsychologist is knowing what feigning failure looks like. And if the patient, the mistake that really makes in that chapter is the patient does really badly on the tests, but actually is quite a coherent speaker about things and seems quite well organized and managed to find the hospital and the hospital room and arrive on time, and yet, scoring at the sort of 10th percentile on things. The patient's presentation needs to align with the other parts of the jigsaw. And when it doesn't, you should be thinking twice. And maybe that moment with undrinkable hospital coffee would be your moment to say, okay, let me just talk it through. Does everything match? No, it doesn't, actually. So in fact, neuropsychologists also have tests, which I won't tell you how they work because that would be breaking the magician's code. But tests which, if you're trying to do badly, we can tell whether it's intentional or not, because it's not a very common issue. But I have a car accident. I could be on $1 million payout and not have to work for the rest of my life. All I have to do is say that I've since that car accident, all sorts of things have gone wrong for me. So I don't do medical legal work of that sort, but it really is a very important issue.
So just kind of as we talk about this, these moments, the stopping to drink undrinkable coffee, talking to the porter about the weather, the one with the undrinkable coffee was you moving into new territory and not recognizing it, and so using old frameworks on new territory. And so there's a lot of that where it's like, if we had just sat and thought about it, it would have gone better. And that seems to transcend many fields. What are some focal practices that people could use, or what's a way of thinking about like these kinds of ways of like rituals that people can install, kind of like the box in the way of the door, but something that you could do in your own life where you could help take the extra moment to intentionally think through the problem and assess at that kind of intuitional whole picture level? Yeah.
So in our intervention, the treatment, we run a traffic light system for our patients. We say that, I don't want you to get to red levels of anger. We need to work out when you're angry is at orange levels, when it's irritation and frustration and so on. So I think, firstly, it's important to audit what you know and don't know. I'm always impressed by people who know their boundaries. I really know that this is true. That, I think I might have read it on Wikipedia. And I meet sometimes people who seem to think they know everything. You've even elected presidents who seem very confident in their knowledge. So I think practicing what the boundaries of your I think we both know the one we're referring to here. He had a tremendous amount of confidence, and if anything, it would be practicing what you know and don't know, and if you're amber, if you think I might be out of my comfort zone, then that would feel to me would be a good time to pause. So, and we find the traffic light thing actually makes quite a difference to our patients. They have to listen a bit more to their body and see, what does irritation feel like, and once they realize what it feels like for them to be a bit frustrated or a bit irritated, and link it to our little practical tool, which is to stop, leave the room.
Right.
You're just going to get angry, and that when you get angry, you might hit somebody. So go out into the garden, have a few deep breaths, and enjoy the flowers. So that would be my best bit of advice, I would say. So can I say it's been really lovely talking to you. The first person I've talked to on the interview with the book, I have one next week, as I said, in Ireland. So it's been fun.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Turnbull. You have a wonderful day.